A Family on Paper. Prologue. Claire Bennett had been holding Noah for almost 3 hours when the doctor finally came through the doors. She already knew. She'd known since the nurse's face in the hallway, since the way the waiting room had gone so quiet around her that she could hear the hum of the vending machine at the far end of the corridor. She knew, and she held Noah anyway. Emily's son, 1 year old, asleep against her shoulder, with his small fist curled against her collarbone. And when the doctor said the words, Claire didn't cry. She just stayed. That was 7 years ago. She was 24, living in a 1-bedroom apartment, teaching 2nd grade, and entirely unprepared to become anyone's parent. Legal guardianship went to her Aunt Margaret, who was 71 and lived alone and had a kind heart and absolutely no idea what to do with a toddler. Claire moved in 2 weeks later. She told herself it was temporary. It wasn't. Noah learned to walk in Margaret's kitchen. He said his first full sentence, "I see the moon," standing on a step stool at the window at 2 in the morning, pointing at the sky with absolute conviction, as if he had discovered something the rest of the world had overlooked. He started school. He made one close friend, a boy named Marcus, and took the friendship with a seriousness that Claire found both charming and a little heartbreaking. He developed an obsession with astronomy that filled 3 notebooks with star charts and covered his bedroom wall with a hand-drawn solar system, complete with distances written in his careful, slightly crooked handwriting. He was 8 years old, and he wanted to see the northern lights someday, and he had a whole notebook dedicated to the conditions required. He called Claire by her name because that's what he'd always called her, and she told herself that was fine. It was fine. It was enough. It was her life, and she had chosen it in the only way that matters, not with a dramatic declaration, but by showing up, one day and then the next, until showing up was simply what she did. When Margaret died, the paperwork she'd been meaning to update, the legal guardianship transfer, the estate documents, all of it, sat on her kitchen table. It took the court less than 3 weeks to find the Carters.
The attorney's name was David Marsh, and he had a calm voice and an office that smelled like old paper and careful decisions. Laura Carter is Noah's biological aunt, he said, his father's sister. The father has been missing for 6 years, legally presumed absent. The Carters have a 4-bedroom home in Columbus, a combined income of $240,000, and a family counselor's letter confirming they're emotionally prepared for this. He paused. They also have a genuine desire to raise him. They're not doing this to be difficult, Claire. They believe it's right. And what do I have? Marsh looked at her steadily. 7 years of presence and a problem. On paper, you're a single teacher with no biological or legal relationship to the child. He let that settle. Then he said, there may be a way to strengthen your position before the hearing. She met Ethan Walker in Marsh's conference room on a Tuesday afternoon in October. She had expected someone polished and indifferent. He was polished, she'd give him that. Good suit, careful posture, the particular stillness of a man who controlled rooms for a living. But he listened when Marsh talked, which she hadn't expected. And when he looked at her, it wasn't the look of someone calculating. It was the look of someone trying to figure out what kind of problem she was. She probably looked at him the same way. The proposal was straightforward. A legal marriage predating the Carter petition by several weeks. For Ethan, it satisfied the stability requirement in his grandfather's family trust before the board vote that would determine the future of Walker Communities. For Claire, it gave the court a household, a home with 2 adults, financial stability, structure. After 8 months, they would divorce. The agreement was already drafted. Separate bedrooms, Ethan said, reading from it. Obviously, Claire said. No interference in each other's professional lives. Agreed. And after 8 months, we're done. She looked up from the document. I understand the terms. He held her gaze for a moment. I have one question. Go ahead. What does the boy know? She hadn't expected that. Nothing yet. He knows things are uncertain. I haven't told him about the Carters. Ethan nodded slowly, looking back at the contract. How old is he? 8. What does he like? Astronomy, space. He wants to see the northern lights someday. She watched him. Why? He didn't answer. He just picked up the pen. They moved in on a Saturday in November. Ethan had prepared, Claire could see that immediately. The separate bedroom for Noah was set up with a desk and a bookshelf full of space books, all brand new, all still in their pristine spines. He'd clearly ordered them online the night before. They were the right subjects and completely wrong editions, too advanced, too textbook formal. But he tried, and she noted that. The gaming console arrived Monday, expensive, complete, left outside Noah's door with a card that read, "For Noah, E.W." Noah opened it, looked at it for a moment, set it aside and asked if he could go read. That evening, Claire found Ethan in the kitchen, standing at the counter with a coffee he hadn't touched, looking out at the backyard. He didn't want it, Ethan said. He didn't sound wounded. He sounded like a man who had just encountered a variable he hadn't factored in, and it bothered him more than he expected. He wanted a telescope, Claire said. Ethan turned. That's what he wanted? He's been saving his allowance for one for 8 months. A long silence. He looked back out at the yard. The kitchen was quiet enough that she could hear the refrigerator hum. I didn't ask, he said finally. No. It was the most honest exchange they'd had. Neither of them commented on it. But later, lying awake in her room with the house quiet around her, Claire found herself thinking about the expression on his face. Not embarrassment, not wounded pride, but something more genuine and more unexpected, like a man who had just discovered there was an entire language he didn't speak and wasn't sure whether to be frustrated or relieved.
2. Something real. 5 weeks in, a storm knocked out power across the neighborhood at 9 in the evening. Noah fell asleep on the couch after the thunder scared him, tucked under a blanket with his star chart notebook pressed against his chest. Claire found candles. Ethan found a bottle of wine she hadn't known he had, and 2 glasses, and set them on the kitchen table without asking if she wanted any. She sat down. They talked about nothing important at first, the storm, the house, the leak in the gutters he'd been meaning to call someone about. The candles threw soft light across the table between them and made the house feel smaller than it was, more like a house someone actually lived in. Then, somewhere in the second glass, he mentioned, almost accidentally, that his parents had divorced when he was 9, that his father had been brilliant and cold, and that Ethan had spent his entire childhood trying to become someone that man would respect, until he was old enough to realize it wouldn't work. And then what? She asked. Then I just kept going. It was already a habit. That's a terrible reason to do anything. I know. He turned his glass in his hands. It worked, though, most of the time. She told him about Emily, about the waiting room, the way time had moved strangely that night, slow and then suddenly not slow at all, about the way it felt to carry a child home from the hospital, knowing that everything was now different and you hadn't been consulted about any of it. Did you resent it? He asked. Sometimes. She looked at the candle between them. Not Noah, never Noah, just the version of my life I'd imagined, which was probably not that interesting anyway. You don't know that. No, she almost smiled. It was the first time she'd seen anything close to one, a small, unguarded thing, gone before she could look at it directly. Outside, the rain had stopped. The storm was moving east, taking the thunder with it. At some point, they had both stopped noticing the dark. "He called me Dad last week," she asked. "I heard. I was in the other room. I'm sorry I didn't come out. I didn't know what to do." "Neither did I. I set down his glass. I keep thinking about it. He's been let down before. He panics when he feels something he's not sure about." She turned her glass slowly. "He was afraid he'd made a mistake." "By saying it?" "By feeling it." She looked at the low candle flame. "Every person he's ever loved has left. His mother, his father, Margaret. He knows on some level that you're leaving too. The contract has an end date. He knows that." She paused. "So when it slipped out, I think part of him thought, if I don't feel this, maybe it won't hurt as much when it ends." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "That's a terrible way to live." "Yes, but it's the way he learned." "I knocked on his door later. Told him I was still here." "I know. I heard that too." He looked at her. Something in his face had shifted, the way a room shifts when a window opens and the air changes. Was that the right thing? It was exactly the right thing. She held his gaze. "You didn't explain. You didn't apologize. You just said you were still there." She paused. That's what he needed to hear. He looked at her for a long moment, and she looked back, and the candle between them was burning very low now, the light unsteady and close. "Good night," she said. "Good night," he said. She lay awake for a long time.
The astronomy competition was in February. Noah had been preparing for 6 weeks. Every evening after dinner, he spread his notes across the kitchen table and worked through orbital mechanics and planetary distances and the history of the Hubble telescope. And Ethan, without being asked, without announcing it, pulled up a chair and helped. They argued about Pluto, at length, with diagrams. Noah maintained the demotion was politically motivated. Ethan said he appreciated the rigor of the classification system. Noah said that was the most depressing thing he'd ever heard. The week before the competition, Noah looked up from his notes and asked, "Will you be there?" "Yes," Ethan said. He meant it. The Meridian Group deal was worth $300 million and had been 18 months in the making. And on the morning of the competition, the other party moved the signing to 1 o'clock, non-negotiable. Ethan told himself he could do both. He couldn't. At 2:47, he was in the back of a car, already knowing, already calculating what to say. He stopped at a specialty shop and bought a professional-grade telescope, the one Noah had been describing for months, the exact model, cost irrelevant. He held the box in his lap the whole way home and told himself it would help. Noah was sitting at the kitchen table when he arrived. The first place ribbon was in front of him. He wasn't touching it. He wasn't reading. He wasn't doing anything at all, just sitting there in the quiet kitchen with his hands flat on the table, and Ethan understood, in a way that went straight past thought, that Noah had been sitting exactly like that since he got home. "I'm sorry," Ethan said. "The meeting ran over. I couldn't—" "It's okay." Noah's voice was flat in the way children's voices go flat when they're doing their best not to show you something. "It's not. I should have been there. I should have—" "You didn't want the telescope." Ethan went still. Noah looked up at him. "I wanted you there." The words were quiet. They weren't angry. That was what made them so hard to absorb. They weren't an accusation, just a statement of fact, delivered with the particular dignity of a child who had already learned not to expect too much and had let himself expect it anyway, just this once, and been wrong. "I know," Ethan said. It was all he had. Noah took the ribbon and went upstairs. He stopped calling Ethan anything after that. When he had to address him directly, he said Mr. Walker, with a politeness that was somehow worse than silence.
The weeks that followed were the hardest of the 8 months. Not because Noah was angry. Anger would have been easier, something to meet, something to respond to. Instead, he simply withdrew. He stopped telling Ethan things. The running commentary about orbital periods and planetary moons and the ongoing injustice of Pluto's demotion went quiet. At dinner, he answered questions in full sentences because Claire had taught him to, but he didn't volunteer anything. And the difference between a child being polite and a child being present was something Ethan felt precisely and couldn't fix. He would drive Noah to school, and Noah would say thank you and get out of the car. He would sit down near Noah in the living room, and Noah would gather his things and move to the kitchen. Not dramatically, not cruelly, just the careful, methodical self-protection of a kid who had been let down by someone he'd started to trust and had decided, quietly and without announcement, that he wasn't going to make that mistake again. Ethan didn't push. He didn't explain himself again, didn't apologize a second time, didn't buy anything. He just kept showing up. To school pickups, to dinners, to the soccer practice where he stood at the back of the parents' section and watched Noah score a goal and look up at the audience, find him, and look away again without expression. He fixed the fence in the backyard over 2 Saturdays alone and didn't mention it to anyone. Claire watched all of this. She said nothing. But one evening, she came into the kitchen to find Ethan standing at the counter after Noah had gone upstairs, very still, looking out at the yard he had just spent a weekend repairing, and she understood, with the clarity of someone who had watched people love Noah for a long time, that Ethan was not calculating how to get back into the boy's good graces. He was just sad. That was the thing she hadn't expected. Not the effort, but the grief underneath it. The look of a man who had finally understood what he stood to lose and was living inside that understanding with nowhere to put it. She didn't say anything. She put the kettle on. After a moment, he turned around and sat at the table, and she made 2 cups of tea, and they sat across from each other in the quiet kitchen, and that was all. 4 weeks later, a math problem. Fractions. Noah came downstairs reluctantly, clearly having exhausted every other option, and asked for help. They worked through it at the kitchen table for almost 2 hours, and when the last problem finally worked, Noah gathered his books and started for the stairs, then stopped in the doorway. He didn't turn around. "Thanks," he said. A pause. "Ethan." Not Mr. Walker, not Dad. But the door had opened just slightly, and Ethan stayed at the table for a long time after he heard the bedroom door close, looking at nothing in particular, feeling something he didn't have a name for yet.
3. The cost. In March, at a charity gala for Walker Communities, Claire wore a dark green dress she'd borrowed from Megan, and Ethan looked at her when she came downstairs in a way that he didn't finish. He started his sentence, stopped, and said they should go, and she filed the unfinished sentence away without examining it. The gala was his world. Marble floors, catered everything, people who moved through rooms like they'd been born in them. He introduced her easily, his hand at the small of her back, and she was surprised to find she wasn't uncomfortable. She knew how to talk to people. She asked questions and listened to the answers, and more than once she caught Ethan watching her from across a conversation with an expression she couldn't read. Then a woman approached, tall, polished, warm smile. Natalie Brooks, former corporate attorney. She called him E and touched his arm when she laughed, and she was exactly the kind of person Claire would have liked under different circumstances. Smart, self-possessed, genuinely kind. She asked about the company. She asked about a project they had apparently once discussed. She was not performing warmth, she simply had it. Claire watched them and thought, with a precision that surprised her, of course someone like him used to be with someone like her. It wasn't bitterness,
It wasn't even jealousy exactly. It was the sudden clear-eyed understanding of a distance she hadn't let herself measure before. The ease of this room, the shared language, the particular way Natalie laughed at something Ethan said, like she'd heard him be funny before and fully expected to again. Natalie Brooks moved through this world as if she'd been issued the key. Claire was a second-grade teacher from a one-bedroom apartment who spent 7 years making sure a small boy didn't feel abandoned. That was who she was. It was enough. It was her life, and she didn't want to trade it for anything. But standing here, at the edge of someone else's ballroom, she finally let herself understand what she'd been refusing to understand for months. She didn't want the contract to end. Not the arrangement, not the custody case protection, not the household structure she'd signed her name to in October. She wanted to stay in that house, in that kitchen, in the life they had made without meaning to. She wanted Ethan to keep being there when she came home. She wanted to keep sitting across from him at the kitchen table and watching him learn, slowly and with real effort, how to be someone Noah could trust. She was in love with him. The realization didn't arrive dramatically. It arrived the way true things often do, quietly and slightly too late, with the distinct feeling that it had been true for a while and she had simply not been paying attention. She excused herself and found a window at the edge of the room. Ethan appeared at her elbow in under 5 minutes, holding a glass of water because she'd mentioned earlier she didn't want wine. He stood next to her and looked out at the city and didn't ask what was wrong. "She seems nice," she said. "She is. We were better as friends." They stood there for a moment, looking out at the lights. "You okay?" he asked. "Yes," she said. She was becoming a better liar. 2 weeks later, Noah broke his wrist at school. A fall during recess, a clean fracture, handled calmly by the school nurse, who called Claire's cell while Claire was in the middle of parent conferences. Claire called Ethan because he was closer. He was already in the hospital waiting area when she arrived. The fracture was minor. Noah was fine, more interested in the X-ray than frightened by it. They fell asleep in the car on the way home. They carried him upstairs together and settled him in his bed, and Claire came back down to find Ethan at the kitchen table with his laptop open and a cold cup of coffee beside it. "You missed something," she said. "Board presentation." He didn't look up from the screen. "Ethan." He looked up. "Thank you," she said. He held her gaze for a moment, then looked back at the laptop. "He's my kid," he said quietly. Then, as if he'd surprised himself, "I mean, I know what you mean," she said. She called Ryan Walker the next morning. 3 words: "I'm not interested." In April, there was a preliminary custody hearing, and Claire sat in a witness chair and answered questions for 40 minutes and did not flinch. She made it out of the building and through the parking lot and to a bench around the side of the courthouse, away from everything, before she stopped. The exhaustion of 7 years pressed down on her at once. Not just the case, not just the Carters, but the whole long weight of loving someone who could always be taken away. She sat down, she breathed, she did not make a sound. Ethan came around the corner 4 minutes later. He sat next to her without asking, not close enough to intrude, just there. The afternoon was warm and quiet, and after a while, she leaned against him because she was too tired not to. He put his arm around her, and she felt his hand settle at her shoulder with the steadiness of someone who intends to stay. And after a moment, their faces moved close together, and for one suspended instant, she almost kissed him. She stepped back. "This is still a contract," she said. She didn't believe it. She could tell from his face that he didn't either. But she said it, and he let her, and she walked to the car without looking back. Behind her, she heard nothing, and she knew without turning around that he was still sitting on the bench.
4. What he chooses. The board meeting was in May.
Ryan presented his case with the unhurried confidence of a man who had been waiting a long time. The private investigator's timeline, the invoices from Marsh's office, the date the marriage license was filed, all of it technically accurate, all of it pointing in one direction. Ethan's attorneys had a response prepared, a version of events that was not dishonest, just shaped. It would have worked. He stood and put it aside. "Our marriage started as an agreement," he said. The room was very quiet. "That's true. Everything Ryan has presented is true. We had a contract, separate bedrooms, clear terms, an end date." He looked at Harold at the head of the table, his grandfather, the man who had built everything in this room from nothing, who had watched his own son take it apart piece by piece. "And somewhere in the middle of it, I sat in a hospital at midnight because a boy with a broken wrist needed someone to be there. And I didn't think about the contract. I didn't think about this room. I just stayed." He paused. "If keeping this company requires me to walk away from my family, then I'm not the right person to lead it." Ryan looked satisfied. He had the vote, probably, and they both knew it. Then Harold stood. The old man looked at Ethan for a long moment. He had the face of someone who had been watching a long time and finally seen what he was looking for. "I needed to know whether you wanted the company more than you wanted people," he said. "Now I have my answer." He looked at Ethan for one more moment, not warmly exactly, but with something that might have been recognition. "Your father built a company. Today you proved you can build a family." He turned to the room. "The trust transfers to Ethan Walker, effective today." The final custody hearing was in June. Claire testified first and told the truth, all of it, including the mistakes, including the fear, including the days she'd been so tired she'd cried in her car before walking into the apartment so Noah wouldn't see. The Carters' attorney asked if she could provide the stability a child required. She said, "I have for 7 years. I intend to keep doing so." Ethan testified second. He was asked to describe his relationship with Noah. He said, "He's my son." The judge asked him to elaborate. He said, "His favorite book is Astrophysics for Young People. His best friend is a boy named Marcus, and he's worried Marcus likes a girl named Sophia more than he likes him. His favorite constellation is Orion because he found it himself, without any help, when he was 6. He paused. "His mother died when he was 1. His father was gone before that. He's been afraid his whole life that the people he loves will leave." Another pause, shorter this time. "I'm not leaving." The court had required all parties to submit an intake questionnaire about the child before the hearing. The Carters' answers were thorough and carefully researched. Every one of them was general. The judge called a brief recess and spoke with Noah privately, in chambers, without the attorneys present. His answer, entered into the record, was 4 words: "With them. With them." In the hallway afterward, Noah slipped his hand into Ethan's and kept walking without saying anything. Ethan looked at him. He didn't say anything either.
The contract end date fell on a Sunday in July. Claire started packing in the morning, methodically folding things into boxes the way she'd learned to fold things away, the way she'd been doing since she was 24. The custody case was over. The company was settled. The agreement had been fulfilled. There was no reason to stay. She was carrying a box toward the front door when Ethan came home. He looked at the box. He took it from her hands and set it on the floor. She waited. "We had a deal," he said. "Yes." 8 months. "Yes." "You kept your side." "We both did." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I'd like to renegotiate." She almost laughed. "That's not how contracts work." "I don't want another contract." He stepped closer. "I don't want an end date. I don't want a custody case." He looked at her directly, without the careful distance that had become so habitual she'd stopped noticing it until right now, when it was gone. "I want you, and if Noah will let me, I'd like to keep being his dad." She looked at him. This was what she wanted. She'd known it since March, since a window overlooking city lights, since she'd understood what she was actually afraid of, and knowing it didn't make the fear go away. "What happens when things get hard?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. He didn't try to solve it efficiently or reassure her quickly. He just looked at her for a moment, and she saw that he understood, not the surface of the question, but what was underneath it. Not what happens when we argue, not what happens when money gets tight. What she was really asking was, what happens when you decide this isn't what you wanted? What she was really asking was the question she'd been carrying since a hospital waiting room at dawn, since every person who'd been supposed to stay had eventually left. "Then we stay," he said, quietly. A pause. "That's what families do." She kissed him. From the top of the stairs, "Does this mean we're not moving?" Ethan looked up. "Not unless you want to." Noah considered this with the gravity of a child taking a formal vote. "We can stay," he said, and disappeared back to his room. The door clicked shut. They stood in the hallway with a half-packed box between them and started laughing, both of them, at the same time, the kind of laughter that has relief in it, and exhaustion, and something that has been waiting a long time to get out.
Epilogue. The northern lights appeared on the second night. They had driven north in late September, Minnesota first, then into Canada, following a forecast that promised clear skies and no guarantees. Noah knew the aurora couldn't be guaranteed. He didn't care. He wanted to try. They found a clearing after dark and set up the telescope and waited, the three of them, with the kind of patience that comes from knowing the waiting is part of it. The sky was full of stars and very quiet for a long time. Then, past midnight, the lights came. Green first, a faint shimmer along the northern horizon, then brighter and broader and blue at the edges, and a pale rose color threading through it that none of them had expected. Noah stood very still with his head tilted back and didn't say a word. Then he bent to the telescope. He found a star cluster and adjusted the lens with the careful concentration of someone who has been doing this long enough to trust their hands. He looked through the eyepiece for a long moment. Then he looked up at Ethan and began explaining what it was, the name of it, the distance in light years, the fact that what they were seeing was old light, light that had left its source before either of them was born. "So we're always looking at the past," Noah said. "In a way," Ethan said. "That's kind of sad. Or it means the light found us anyway, eventually." Noah considered this. Then he turned back to the telescope with the air of someone filing the answer away for later. Ethan listened to him breathe. He was not looking at the sky. He was looking at the boy, at the specific way Noah's hands moved when he was explaining something he loved, at the absolute absence of fear in his face, at what it meant that a child who had spent his entire life waiting for people to leave was standing in a field in Canada at midnight explaining stars to someone he trusted completely. No hesitation in it, no performance, just the simple, unguarded certainty of a kid who knew where home was. Noah finished adjusting the lens, glanced back. "Thanks, Dad." Offhand, completely natural, the way you thank someone for passing the salt because it had never occurred to you that they might not. Ethan couldn't speak for a moment. Claire found his hand in the dark. Her fingers were cold. He closed his around them. Above them, the lights moved slowly across the sky, green and blue, and that thin thread of rose along the bottom that none of them had expected. The unexpected color that made the whole thing feel more than a forecast and a clear night, like something that had been waiting for the right people to show up. Ethan looked up at it. After spending his entire life building things, companies, strategies, positions, advantages, he finally understood what he had actually been looking for. Not the arrival, not the achievement, not the moment when you could stop. This, exactly this. The cold air, the telescope, the boy explaining old light, the woman beside him, her hand in his, not saying anything because she didn't need to. He was home.